G'day everyone, welcome back to the channel. So in today's video, we're going to go through 5 really important stretches for any swimmer to do if you're looking to recover or rehabilitate from any swimming related injury, whether you're hoping to prevent those swimming related injuries, or you're someone who isn't injured but just wants to swim better, who wants to optimize your mechanics to perform better long term. So, and it's really important because these 5 exercises are exercises that I guess characterize the essence of a lot of dysfunction that happens from swimming or that happens to people who swim. Now, it may sound strange because there's such a long list of injuries and issues that can happen from swimming, but when you line them all up and you keep taking a step back and trying to figure out what the root cause of each of those issues are, surprisingly, there are a number of things that interconnect. And there are a couple of really basic issues that tend to set a bunch of different issues up to fail. And I want to represent those, or those are represented in the exercises that we'll go through today. So I'm hoping that if you're someone who has any swimming related injury, you want to prevent them, or you're looking to just move better and swim better without having to train harder, for example, then hopefully these 5 exercises are going to be highly applicable and highly useful to you guys. And what I would suggest is if you are someone who's about to go for a swim or you've got a swim planned in the short term, please give these exercises a go before you go out to swim, so that when you do swim, you'll hopefully be pleasantly surprised at how much better you move or how much better a particular issue or injury may feel. You're just managing it for the time being. So highly recommend these 5 exercises. Before we get to them though, obviously if you do go on to enjoy the video, please consider leaving a like below. And if you enjoy this kind of content and you want to follow along, then please consider subscribing. It really helps the channel grow. It helps these ideas get out to more people, which is obviously the main idea behind it. We want to help as many people as possible solve their aches and pains with the information that we have and that we've learned over many years of being physical therapists and being in the industry. So I guess the main thing we want to talk about here is that regardless of whether you have neck pain when swimming, back pain when swimming, a whole range of shoulder related issues from shoulder impingements, bursitis, rotator cuff injuries, whether you have arthritis anywhere, whether you have some hip or some knee pain, depending on what you get when you're swimming, hopefully the essence of these 5 exercises will help you address those issues in some way. And I guess we want to make sure that you see those results afterwards. So let us know in the comments below, what are you dealing with at the moment? What's stopping you from swimming, or what issue or injury are you currently carrying or managing while you're swimming? And then if you go on to enjoy the video and do the exercises, let me know what they did for you. Let me know what they did mechanically, let me know what they did for the specific issues that you have. So as we get to these exercises, I want to make sure that I'll quickly sort of touch on what they're hopefully going to be good for. I'll show you the exercise and then we'll move on to the next one and repeat that process. So the first exercise we want to go through is probably one of the best hip stretches I've ever seen. And when you talk swimming, hip range of motion or hip dysfunction isn't necessarily the thing that crops up for most people. It's not the first thing that pops into your head. Most people think shoulder pain when swimming, but clearly your hips do a lot of the driving. There's a lot of power in those hips that you use to transfer that energy when you're doing freestyle, backstroke, definitely butterfly, but more importantly with breaststroke, because what we see a lot with people who do breaststroke is that there's a lot of knee pain in breaststroke, and it can be a really confusing thing for a lot of people because you might do all this amazing treatment for your knees, but you might actually neglect the really stiff, immobile joint, one joint higher up, which are the hip joints. And what we find clinically is that if you have any knee pain while doing breaststroke, or even any of the other strokes, to be fair, it may suggest that your hips aren't mobile enough and your body's having to compensate for that at the cost of your knees. So this exercise is fantastic for any knee pain that people have in or outside the pool. It will help obviously with any back pain as well, because again, the joint above, or the joints above your hips, the joints below your hips can cop a lot of the force that your hips should be tolerating and should be sort of eating up. They can be sort of dispersed to the areas around it if that isn't mobile enough. So the first exercise we want to do, it's a hip capsule stretch. Now you don't necessarily need a power band, but this is an amazing, it adds an amazing flavor to the exercise. It's hard to get without it, but I'll do it with this, but the essence is still the same. So you want to have the band high up into that hip joint. And what we're going after here is we're going after the hip joint capsule. And because we spend a lot of time sitting, this joint or these joints can get quite stiff and the capsule can become quite thickened and stiff and tight, limiting the ability for that joint to move. So
Again, you don't have to have the band on, but if you do have the band, you want it pulling laterally to open up the hip and distract that hip. But all we want to do here is we want to imagine that we're letting the thigh bone or the thigh itself press out the back corner of the hip. And how to do that is we want you to come down a little bit into some hip flexion, and then keeping your shoulders and hips together, we want to shift everything together across over that side that you're stretching. So we're not leaving the hips and the shoulders behind. You're not leaving the shoulders behind and shifting the hips. And you're not doing it the other way. You're not coming all the way across. We're trying to stay sort of parallel to the ground, shifting across and down or back, depending on where you feel you start to notice some tightness at the side of the hip here. Again, it shouldn't pinch at the front. If it does, then you're probably too far into that hip flexion, and it's better to come out of that a little bit more. And the reason why this is really important is because in this position, we can bias a lot of the rotational restrictions that people have in the hips. So what we want to do first is we want to rotate that whole leg under the back leg and block it. And we want to do the same thing. We want to come back across towards that hip that you're stretching. This time, instead of the pressure feeling more so at the side, you might find it's more at the back towards your back pocket, towards those piriformis muscles, the center of those glutes. And again, you can maneuver up and down to find where the best expression of that tightness is for you. And we just want to hang out here. Once you've done that, we can do the same thing in the other direction. So taking that foot out from under you, rotating it into more of an internally rotated hip position. And again, we can drop down into some hip flexion and across, looking for some of that pressure. This time it won't be at the back or the side. It'll be a little bit more towards the front. Again, we're not talking groin or front of the hip. If it's catching it all, again, come out of that hip flex position into more of a 90-degree hip position, and you should be able to find a better shape that feels okay. Because what happens when you're doing that sort of breaststroke is you do need some flexion, some rotation in the hip. And if you don't have that and are missing that, then it's very easy to overload your knee, make those tissues sore and uncomfortable very quickly. And again, I'd urge anyone to do that before swimming. You don't have to do the band as well, but it just adds a whole nother layer or a whole nother sort of avenue to benefit how quickly that frees up. And you'll be pleasantly surprised at how mobile it feels really quickly. So for me, my right side feels a little bit tight. This one feels quite loose and free. So can't speak of that one highly enough for any hip issues, any knee issues, any low back issues. It's a great one to feed some slack to whatever area might be a little bit uncomfortable at the moment. So the next one's a really, really important one, because this almost forms the centerpiece of the majority of the dysfunction that you will feel as a swimmer. And that's an exercise to free up your upper back. Now, a lot of people don't realize that if your upper back is stiff, so the joints of your rib cage and the joints of your thoracic spine in that upper section, you need mobility through those areas to have normal neck function and shoulder function. So if you have any shoulder pain, any neck dysfunction, you need to be able to free up the joints and the stiffnesses and the tightnesses that you might have in that upper back. And for me personally, the best way to do this is with a ball. So you can use a single lacrosse ball, a double lacrosse ball, or you can use a tennis ball, depending on what kind of pressure and density that you need. So for me, I'm going to use a double lacrosse ball. Single one's fantastic, but so what we're going to do with this is we're going to place this sort of straddling the spine in the middle. You can bias just one side with one ball or both. Either side helps. So just to hopefully highlight what this does, I don't know if you can see this on camera, but this is how far my right side goes. This is how far my left side goes. So if you can just see that part of my shoulder here, just get a sense of how far that goes relative to the other side. Because I'm going to do this exercise and I want to show you how you can really improve the mobility of those shoulders, which again is really important for freestyle, backstroke, clearly important for anyone doing butterfly, maybe less important for anyone doing breaststroke, but shoulder mobility is shoulder mobility, and good shoulder mobility suggests better function than stiff shoulders. So basically we want to place this in your upper back. So for me, actually, I'm going to do it straight up and down so I can bias one side. So essentially I've got two lacrosse balls on this side, one on top of the other. So what I want to do here is I want to find some areas that feel a little bit stiff and a little bit tight. So for me, it's not very hard to find, so it's a little bit stiff there. And if you can see where the ball's pressing, I've got two balls in there. Again, use one, use a tennis ball if you feel you need it. All I'm going to do here is I'm going to come up into shoulder flexion. So full range of motion dictates that I should be able to have the ball in here and get my forearm to touch the ground. So as you can see at the moment, my upper back and my shoulders are a fraction stiffer than I'd like it to be. But the great thing about this exercise is within about
10, 15, 20 seconds of just actively mobilizing the joints at the back, using shoulder flexion to do that. In a very short amount of time, I'm getting very close to getting down to that, to the floor. And it now feels like there's less restriction there. It feels a lot easier than it did before. And the benefits of doing that is what you should see straight away. Again, hopefully I'm in the same position here, but if you can compare this to what it was before. So this is the side I didn't do. This is the side that I did do. And for me, all of a sudden, I've got this extra range of motion to play with because I've taken that stiff handbrake off, so I can now move through that position. And the important thing to do with the ball is that if you can imagine my shoulder blade is here, so here, for example, we want to start at the very top where that first rib is. We're going to slowly work our way down just inside of that shoulder blade, looking for any stiffnesses or tightnesses that might be limiting normal range of motion. And we know for swimming that shoulder flexion, obviously abduction and internal rotation are really, really important to have in order to express normal motion and prevent injuries and dysfunction. So just by putting a ball and going hunting through your upper back for any of those stiff spots, and then using movements to try and really free up that tissue, then you can restore and improve your shoulder range of motion very quickly. And as I said before, you can feed some slack into the neck, feed some slack into the shoulder. So if you're someone who impinges that shoulder, it may not be that that shoulder itself is a problem, but you might have this, this heavy stiffness in your upper back so that your shoulder doesn't move and it jams up more easily than someone who doesn't have that there. And again, for any swimmer out there, if you want to be able to generate more power in your stroke and again prevent those injuries, we need to make sure that that upper back is as mobile as can be on both sides so that you can just express normal function as you deserve to. So that's exercise number 2, is taking a ball to your upper back and freeing that up. Now, the third exercise sort of moves out more towards the shoulder, and similar to the hip, sometimes those shoulder joint capsules can become just as stiff as a hip joint capsule. Again, the hip joint tends to get stiff from us just sitting at 90 degrees all day on computers, relaxing back into couches, and not necessarily expressing full hip range of motion as often as we should. The same thing tends to apply with the shoulder, but for most people, that shoulder stiffness and tightness that can restrict normal function often comes from slouchy shapes, often, again, sitting related, driving related, watching TV. Even if you're just sort of in a job or a workplace that asks you to sort of reach forward a lot, the weight of the arm consistently pulls on that shoulder joint. That shoulder capsule can become stiffer and tighter just because it's having to cope with that extra load 24/7, or at least in the for the entire time that you're doing that, that you're in that position for. So when we're looking at a shoulder joint restriction, so the capsule becomes stiff, it's very common for people with frozen shoulders to have a capsule that's very tight and stiff. But if you can't sort of get into a full sort of expression of normal range, you might find that rotation is limited because the joint capsule itself has become stuck or has become a bit restricted, similar to the hip. So again, same concept as the hip. We want to try and improve the amount of rotation at the joint, but also improve how that joint expresses movements in that really specific area. And a lot of the muscular tightness over the top can start to improve if you've taken away that rusty joint stiffness. So one of the things I really like with this as an exercise is we can take the same band that we use for the hip, we can do the same exercise that we did for the hip, but do it on the arm as well. So it's the same concept, so it's the same position as before when we had you in this position. This time all we're going to do is we're going to imagine that the arm is pushing out the back corner of the shoulder. Now, we shouldn't feel any pain at the side or the front. It should all be at the back if we're doing this correctly. So what you can do is if you take your shoulder blades back so your shoulders are in a stable position, same deal, we're going to shift across to that side, shift everything together. Again, we're not just moving your hips across, we're shifting your shoulders across, looking for some pressure at the side of that shoulder, and we just want to hang out here. Now, if you want to go a little bit deeper into this, you can do it on your elbows. Really make that, all the pressure go specifically through that joint. It's the same deal. You can sort of shift up and down and slowly shift across, looking for a position that feels comfortable, where you're getting some pressure on that side of the shoulder. Now, much like the hip exercise, we do still want the capacity to bias internal rotation and external rotation of the shoulder. So you can sort of maneuver that forearm into a more internally rotated position, and again, come across and to the side, and looking for some tightness in that position. Again, not jamming up at the front here. And then if you want to bias that external rotation, we just externally rotate the shoulder, maintaining a good position,
and then coming across again, looking for a position that gives you some access to that tightness, and then hanging out here. So again, the beautiful thing about that is we can see that there's hopefully an immediate change in how far that arm moves in that rotational capacity, because we know that rotation is really important. So what I urge people to do is obviously do a few movements to begin with, see how it feels to move first, do the stretch, then repeat those movements so that you see that it changes in a way that you maybe didn't think it would, or you wouldn't notice that it does unless you test and retest it. So the first exercise is making sure that we really free up the hip joint capsule. Second exercise is taking a ball to find and get rid of as much upper back stiffness, joint stiffness as possible, to feed some slack into the neck, feed some slack into the shoulder. The third exercise is to go after the shoulder joint capsule. Again, we want to take away that underlying joint restriction to allow everything to be expressed more normally. The fourth exercise is still staying at the shoulder. I just wanted to do two for the shoulder because I think it's such an important joint, obviously. We've obviously done the shoulder joint capsule, but the probably second most, or not second most, but one of the most closely related ranges of motion to dysfunction, or a lack of range of motion to dysfunction, is that internal rotation. And if we're missing a lot of internal rotation, whether it be because the underlying joint capsule is stuck, or because a lot of the muscles at the back of the shoulder have become tight, then instead of being able to keep our shoulders in a good position, coming up to sort of 90 degrees and rotating down, for example, which looks a lot like a lot of strokes that we do, instead of being able to maintain a stable shoulder joint, if you're lacking that range of motion and you need to get down to here, for example, then if you can't get there, the shoulder has to sort of hinge forward or dump forwards and put all those tissues in a bad shape just to make up that difference. So we need to make sure that you can express normal range of motion whilst having a good shoulder joint position. Otherwise, if you run out of range, then that shoulder is going to have to cheat to figure a way around that. And that's very bad for impingements, bursitis, rotator cuff tears, labral issues, doesn't matter what it is. If that shoulder is consistently dumping forwards while you're swimming, you're just using it poorly and then set things up for injury. So one of the ways that I like to do this is a very, very simple stretch. So basically, we want to get you onto your back, and again, shoulder blades in a good position. So shoulder blades back across the upper back. We want to get your hips up off the ground, and we want to slide your hand underneath. Now, the higher you go, the more rotation you need. So you can start down low at your hips if you want to, and then we're going to just slowly drop those hips to gently rotate that arm and that shoulder down. So, but the key is for you is that we don't want to get to a point where you run out of that range and that shoulder has to come up in order for you to cheat. We only need you to go down as far as you feel you can before that shoulder joint wants to pop up. So for me, I'm very fortunate my shoulders are mobile, so I can come up a little bit higher towards my shoulder blades here, and as I drop down, I can start to feel a more intense stretch through the front of the shoulder here, a rotational stretch. Again, I wouldn't be doing this if my shoulder was popping up like that. It defeats the purpose of the stretch. But again, what we're hoping for when we do that is, when we do that internal rotation, you should hopefully feel like it goes further than the other side. So for me, for some reason, I'm a little bit tighter on my right-hand side. When I come down on this left-hand side, I've got a lot more range of motion before I need to cheat to get into that same position. So again, it's really, really good to go after the internal rotation. Clearly important for any sort of freestyle, even making sure that you've got that stability in your shoulder when you're doing some backstrokes. Same thing when you're coming up and doing butterfly, and obviously that rotation that you use when you're doing breaststroke as well. So clearly it's an important feature. If you don't have internal rotation of your shoulder, then everything basically has to compensate for that, and it can be a mess of issues going forward. So that's number 4. So the second one for the shoulder, first one's shoulder joint capsule. The second one is just more so for the soft tissue around that. And for each of these exercises, I should say, you want to do them for as long as you feel like you need to. So if you want to aim for 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes, that's fine. If any one of these exercises feels particularly stiff, then just obsess over it for 10 minutes, 15 minutes, whatever you can be bothered doing in front of the TV at night or before you go for a swim, just so that you start to chip away at some of that underlying dysfunction. Now, the final exercise of the 5, it sort of hopes to help anyone that's dealing with some neck pain. Now, one of the best things about these exercises is because they hopefully go after some of the very root underlying issues that set most problems up to fail. By doing the upper back mobility exercise, you're hopefully going to improve the mobility of your neck as well. For example, when you rotate and turn your head to one side,
you don't just turn through the joints and the levels of your neck, you still get some subtle rotation through the upper back joints as well, or at the very least, a lot of the soft tissue that attaches into the neck also connects into the upper back and the chest and the side of the neck as well. So not only do we want to make sure that those joints are moving, but it allows all this soft tissue around that to move more freely without a handbrake on. But we also want to go after something very specific. So again, you can use a single lacrosse ball, a double lacrosse ball, tennis ball, whatever you want to do, whatever you feel gives you best access to this. Again, I'll use a double lacrosse ball just because it's a bit easier for me. And what we want to do is similar to the upper back here, we want to place the ball. So with a double, you can place it either side. If it was just a single, you'd want to put it somewhere on one side of the neck. And all we need you to do again is just lie down on top of this. So it's very, very similar to the upper back exercise where we are using movement. It's a little bit different with the neck. It's a little bit harder to use movements in order to do this. But all I need you to do here is just slowly move the ball around until you feel like you hit a spot that feels a little bit stiff or a little bit tight. And then all we need you to do is stay here. So we just want to spend enough time with the ball pressing into those joints, allowing them to give over time. And then once you feel like you've had enough, then you just move the ball up a fraction or down a fraction, depending on where you feel you need it. And then by doing this, you'll find that you'll start to figure out where your main restrictions are. And just as a little tip for anyone, if anyone has some issues rotating their neck, obviously the upper back's important, but generally a lot of the rotation in the neck comes from the very top of that neck towards the base of the skull. So if you want to get the ball right up into the base of that neck, right at the back where the bump is, just let it roll off to the side a fraction, go looking for some restriction and some stiffness there. Now I should say, one of the things that people get sort of mixed up with a lot when we're looking at sort of mobility exercises with the ball is that it doesn't have to feel tender. It certainly may. It may feel a little bit tender and uncomfortable if there's some muscular issues there as well. But when we're dealing with stiff joints, often we're not dealing with a tangible sense of pain or tenderness. It just doesn't move very well. So if you compare one side to the other, one side should feel like it sinks in easier. The other side should feel like it's just a bit rusty and a bit stiff. It doesn't press in as easily. That's clearly the side that you need to spend most time on. So whether either side hurt or not almost doesn't matter for these exercises. You obviously want to respect it if it does, but we're prioritizing the stiffness and the tightness over the pain. So if any joint that you're working through from the top of your neck down to sort of that mid-thoracic area, let's just say that that right-hand side feels really tender, really sore, but the left-hand side actually feels really stiff and really tight. Interestingly, you actually want to spend more time on the stiff and tight side because mechanically, that handbrake can change everything around it. And often that pain is probably going to be a consequence of that stiffness. That's become sore because this isn't doing what it's supposed to do. Much like a lot of the things that we've been talking about, where if your upper back is stiff, it can cause your shoulder to become a problem. If the deep shoulder joint is stiff, it can cause any sort of dysfunction around that shoulder. If your back's stiff, your neck can become a problem. If your hips are stiff, your back, hips, and knees can become a problem. So hopefully with those 5 exercises, there's a broad spectrum of really root underlying issues that you guys can go after to systematically sort of try and conquer any of the issues that you have, whether they're chronic issues that you've had for a long time, whether it's a fresh issue, whether you're just trying to improve it so you don't get one down the track, or just swim better. It's very, very common to find that if someone has a bad knee, maybe you had an old sports injury and you think, well, I can't do anything about that. Well, guess how that old sports injury feels if the one joint above that is horribly stiff. So you may not necessarily be able to undo the ravages of time or the damage that was done many years ago, but by freeing up the next joint up, you're feeding a lot more slack down to that area and allowing that to function better than it was before. You can optimize what's there irrespective of what's actually there. So take that approach to everything and just go hunting through those 5 different exercises to see what you come up with. Then go for a swim and see how you feel. And then obviously let us know in the comments below, because I want to make sure that everyone feels like these videos are useful and they work more than anything. So with that being said, I think we've gone for long enough now. Hopefully that was useful. If it was, let us know. Please consider leaving a like and subscribing if you do enjoy the content. And then we'll see you in the next one.